Four structures operate at the macro level. They are vocatives, a reversal involving the term hand, sayings that ensnare, and finally, the development of plot. Let's first consider the points at which the sage uses vocatives. Clues to the overall structure of Poem 5 may be detected in part by noting 4 vocatives. That's an unusually large number of vocatives, indicative of the high level of concern felt by the poet. Each vocative marks the opening of a new section or block. So in verse 1, the vocative, my son, opens the entire poem. That same vocative, my son, will mark the first hemistich of section 2. Do this then, my son, in verse 3. The third vocative will mark the first hemistich of block 2b, that is verse 6. Now the vocative is not my son, but rather the label, lazy fellow. That same vocative, lazy fellow, will recur in the first hemistich of section 3, verse 9. So we see the sage using vocatives, whether my son or lazy fellow, at strategic boundary points within the structure of this poem. Next is the macrostructure involving reversal concerning the words hands and grip, found in sections 1 and 2. Both the clasping of hands to confirm a contract that we read in verse 1 and the ensnaring grip that we read of in verse 3 employ the same term for hand. Literally in Hebrew, this is the word referring to the palm of the hand. Despite this similarity, there is a reversal at work. In the first, the youth is sealing an agreement of his own free will. He is a free agent. But in the second reference to hand, he has become a captive. A third macrostructure involves sayings that ensnare. These show up in sections 1 and 3. Within the first section, the grandfather traced the youth's capture to something that he said, statements committing himself to guarantee someone else's loan. He was caught. We read, trapped by the sayings of his mouth. In fact, that phrase occurs twice in verse 2. Perhaps this alludes to some verbal formula serving to solemnize a pledge of security, maybe analogous to a formula regarding a levirate marriage contract that we read of in Deuteronomy 25 and Ruth 4. Yet this is not the only saying that is harmfully uttered by the youth. When we come to section 3, the sage seems to quote the youth, affirming his voluntary entrapment within indolence. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to lie down, we read in verse 10. Evidently this, at some point, had been the youth's own reply to the prodding questions, how long and when, that the grandfather issues in verse 9. Thus, the youth has been snared by 2 of his statements, one of a contract nature and the second of a complacency nature. This brings us to the last macrostructure. In this we will explore the development of plot across this poem. And here we are using a degree of imagination to consider how may the various ideas we encounter in the poem flow from one to another. Just as a community's laws often arise from specific cases, sapiential compositions also may trace to specific episodes in the life of a sage. Although no names or dates accompany this poem, reflecting on how the plot unfolds may illuminate what sorts of circumstances may have driven the grandfather to employ the tones and techniques evident in his composition. Apparently, an outsider has arrived on the scene seeking assistance to secure a loan. Lacking sufficient reserves of collateral, and with inadequate reputation for credit, he turns to the youth for help. Whether the youth is motivated by compassion or by consideration of profit, we do not know. Ben Sira indicates that gain could be made by securing another person's loan. We read, "A sinner will fall into surety as he pursues profit-taking. He will fall into lawsuits." Regardless the motive, pledges here have been exchanged, hands have been clasped, and the deal is sealed. Upon hearing of this agreement between the youth and a stranger, the grandfather becomes deeply concerned. His speech here betrays his level of agitation. He must fashion a reprimand in hopes of rescuing the youth from ruin. The perils that he observes are not one, but two that have grown intertwined. The short-range peril stems from a contract trap. The long-range peril stems from a complacency trap. His approach will address both perils. First, he concentrates on the pressing short-range crisis. "You have been caught by the sayings of your mouth," he says in chapter 6, verse 2. This crisis then dominates the initial counsel spanning verses 3 through 5. At the same time, the grandfather realizes that the best of counsel for escaping the contract trap will avail nothing until the youth motivates himself to go and plead with the foreigner to cancel his guarantee. Evidently, the youth has a track record of wasting counsel through inaction. That would explain why early on the grandfather infuses advice regarding the contract trap, infusing it with elements of complacency trap advice. We're examining here verse 4, which reads, "Do not keep on granting sleep to your eyes and slumber to your eyelids." That's couched right amid the concentrated counsel to extract himself from the loan. As the grandfather observes the youth's slowness to reckon with his own great peril, it dawns on the grandfather that he must marshal still more resources to help the youth escape the gravitational pull of complacency. So, he composes a block of teaching that will lead the youth into a vital discovery through the process of observation. By the way, observation is the classic sapiential avenue to gaining insight. We're referring here to verses 6 through 8. What the youth should discover is that even inferior insects are able to behave wisely through methodical forethought and routine self-motivation, something the youth is missing. The grandfather is not content merely to extinguish the present fire of financial crisis. He schemes to impart the greater gift of lasting character reformation, provided, of course, the youth will accept it. And therein lies the lesson's ending, an unfortunately tragic conclusion. Notice verses 9 through 11. For the words of verse 10 are cast as though the youth is rebuffing his father's reprimand. I say they are cast as though rebuffing, since in this line's source context, notice Proverbs 24, verse 33, 24:33. It there may have represented the sage's own musing, not a youth's actual interjection. When the youth's persistent inaction is called to account through the prodding questions of verse 9, how long? Instead of minding the reprimand and mending his ways, the youth pushes his parent away with an arrogant assurance, insisting that everything's under control. Under control indeed, responds the grandfather. For sooner than he can possibly realize, the youth and all his fine resources will be stolen away by someone who is on the move, which incidentally is an apt reversal, since the youth refuses to do exactly that, to move. We may mistakenly infer that the thief is the foreigner, that con man of verses 1 and 3. No, replies the grandfather, for were that the case, we could at least to some degree blame someone else. No, the youth will be waylaid by his own laziness. In the final analysis, he will have none to blame but his own arrogant self. To commence life naive, that is typical. Later on, adamantly to cling to naivete, that is profoundly tragic. This concludes the macrostructures. Let's close in to examine microstructural features. There are 7 microstructures that lend shape to this 5th poem. They are conditional structure, acceleration through repetition, an intrusive imperative, a secondary imperative, closure operating at the block level, images of animals, captive or free, and finally repetition of the imperative, go. Let's first consider the conditional structure that appears in section 1. The first section consists of a conditional statement. Verse 1 of chapter 6 presents a double protasis, and verse 2 a double apodosis. Incidentally, Waltke in his commentary views it this way. Fox, on the other hand, proposes that the protasis continues on into verse 2, with the apodosis not beginning until verse 3. I'm inclined to agree with Waltke. The grammar of it makes good sense as a double protasis in verse 1, a double apodosis in verse 2, although admittedly there is room for negotiation when it comes to understanding the Hebrew at this point. For the next couple of minutes, we're going to shed some insight on these 2 verses, drawing from Hebrew grammar. If you've had Hebrew, this will reinforce your understanding and illuminate it. If you haven't, just stay with me a bit and we'll move on to the next microstructural feature in just a bit. To appreciate how the sage has conveyed the message of verses 1 and 2, we want to be aware that generally a conditional statement begins with a verb form that refers to future potentiality. The best form to use for that is the yictol. A yictol typically follows the if clause or the if particle in Hebrew. That would lead to the following sort of message. If ever in the future, notice future potentiality, you may chance to commit action A, then something else will happen, future-oriented. However, rather than using that customary yictol form for the protasis in both parts of verse 1, instead we find here the poet employed the katal conjugation, which typically and routinely looks to the past. In this way, the grandfather was evidently seeking confirmation concerning what he gathered had already transpired in the life of the youth, and that would read, generally expressed, as follows. My son, if in fact you have committed, notice the past tense, action A, and then the apodosis follows. The deed that he suspects has already transpired involves co-signing a neighbor's loan. The second half of verse 1 continues that past tense protasis. It skips repeating the particle if, so we need to supply that in English. And if you have clasped your hands with the foreigner, that would be the end of verse 1b. Now the apodosis, the then statements, which show up in verse 2, similarly employ grammar that's past-oriented. They continue to use the katal forms, not the future-oriented form that we usually find in an apodosis, which is the vekatal form. The grandfather is saying, if you committed action A in the past, that's verse 1, pledging an ill-advised contract, then consequences B and C followed, past tense, that action. What is it that actually has already transpired consequent on sealing the deal, that ill-advised financial deal? Namely these in verse 2. You have been caught. You have been trapped. The double apodosis of verse 2 reveals to the youth what in reality happened when he merely co-signed the loan. Some consequences kicked into gear which are already now past tense. This establishes that right now, since those things are in his past, the current condition that he's in, the current circumstance he's in, is already in critical mode. This is what we refer to then as the microstructure involving the conditional statements of verses 1 and 2. A second microstructure involves acceleration through repetition. When we move from verse 1 to verse 2, it seems as though the pace accelerates. And this is because of a phrase that's twice repeated in verse 2, by the sayings of your mouth. This uncharacteristically simple repetition with no differentiation at all between the first appearance and second appearance, this seems to betray on the one hand that the parent is reaching a condition of being nearly frantic in his level of anxiety regarding his youth's predicament. So urgent is this crisis that he dispenses with any literary refinement of searching for variation in his parallelism. As far as he's concerned, any ending phrase will do, just so long as he can swiftly sound the alarm before all is lost. At the same time, this simple repetition may be calculated to put us as readers on the alert in case later in the poem any actual sayings of his mouth might break into the airwaves. Consider then what happens when we reach verse 10. The next microstructure involves the urgency of an intrusive imperative beginning in verse 3. Since it is prefaced by no conjunction that would customarily introduce an apodosis, that is the beginning of verse 3, we're saying it does not read, then do this. That then is not present at the front end of that hemistich 3a. The sage prevents the reader from supposing that this intrusive imperative, do this, in 3a, somehow contributes to the apodosis back in verse 2. We're saying there is a break between 2 and 3. 3, by its abrupt start with the imperative do this, is breaking off from verse 2. It is not simply a cascading continuation of the apodosis of verse 2. The poet thereby also steers us away from inferring that the four hemistichs of verses 1 and 2 all together form a compound protasis, just a four-member if statement. The way verse 3 is presented to us intrusively, it prevents us from drawing that conclusion. Here's the impact of this observation. It means that when we encounter the imperative beginning verse 3, reading, do this then, my son, this intrusive imperative begins a new thought, as if the sage were hastily constructing a rhetorical levy, trying to divert the destructive consequences that have been unleashed through the co-signing of the loan. He is creating a protective barrier. The next microstructure involves a secondary imperative in verse 4. Primary imperative, do this then, my son. But notice that verse 4 also has an imperative. After issuing 5 imperatives in verse 3 that instruct the youth to escape his ensnaring contract, verse 4 follows with yet another imperative. Yet this second command solves not a snare of contract, but one of complacency. It reveals the parent's growing awareness that indolence looms as a character defect within the youth, anterior to the presenting problem of an ill-advised financial contract. And now, a microstructure involving block-level closure. We're looking now at verse 5. A threefold closure in verse 5 unifies Block 2a. Block 2a spans verses 3, 4, and 5. It combines short-range solutions that are specialized in that block. First, the compressed solution shouted earlier in verse 3, extricate yourself. That same command recurs as the first word of verse 5, extricate yourself. Second, the present peril of being caught in a grip, that was referred to in 3b, now recurs in the need to break free of the hunter's grasp and to break free from a snare's grasp in verses 5a and b. Third, the need to escape from sleepy complacency that's implied by verse 4 resembles the need to escape from snares, already referred to in verse 5, although we must admit that the snares in verse 5 presume a level of adrenaline not present in the sleep-entombed state of verse 4. These, then, are three ways that closure is affected in verse 5 at the block level. While we're looking at verse 5, it's worth mentioning that the term fowler at the close of verse 5, which in Hebrew is yakush, recalls the verb to be caught at the start of verse 2, and that in Hebrew is nokashta. Yakush and nokashta. You can hear some of the similarities there. Nokashta in verse 2 was the very first expression within this poem that revealed the fact that the contract had turned into a captor. The next microstructure involves images of animals, captive or free, both occurring in section 2. The two blocks of section 2 each present images of animals. The first depicts birds who have lost their liberty, or gazelles similarly caught. The second depicts mere insects who retain their liberty and who use it to take collaborative initiative, storing up food against future need. The last microstructure involves repetition of the imperative go, occurring in verses 3 and 6. The two blocks of section 2 then share this repeated imperative. Go in verse 3 urges the youth to hastily appeal for release from the loan guarantee contract. In verse 6, go urges the youth to overcome sleepy indolence by noticing how diligently even insects apply themselves. Thus, through the microstructures and the macrostructures of this 11-verse poem, we get a sense of how the shape of it is configured by artful use of various repetitions, recurrences, imperatives, reversals, various devices that the sage uses to configure his message artfully in this composition. In the next portion of this lecture, we'll turn to comments that will illuminate particular points of the composition.